Alrighty. Hey, you guys. The last few topics of Unit 2 population, and it specifically deals with migration. Okay, you're going to get three topics in this one lecture. Yeah, let's take a look. All right, so first one is 2.10, the causes of migration. Right, and just to be clear, you guys, make sure that you've read the whole chapter on migration in the textbook. Um, Migration, chapter 3. All right. That has a lot of the information in this lecture. Some of it's not necessarily in it, but it's important to read it so you have an idea of what I'm talking about here. All right. So 2.10, causes of migration. Okay. Enduring understanding, it'll be pretty much the same for the three topics here, but changes in population are due to mortality, fertility, and migration. So migration here. All right. And we'll be looking at some factors that deal with migration, economic, environmental, political, cultural, all the usual stuff. Okay, so let's explain how different causal factors encourage migration. Okay, the causes of migration usually divided into two groups. We've got pull factors and push factors. Pull factors are things that draw you into an area, so that make you want to go somewhere. Push factors are factors that, things that push you away from an area. So they make it so that you don't want to live in a specific area. All right. And it's always a combination of these two factors that get people to migrate. All right. We'll kind of break down, specific push and pull factors, looking at, different types. So economic, environmental, political, so on and so on. All right. I'm going to begin with economic here. All right. Things that might push people out of a country or state, right, for economic reasons might be, high unemployment, lack of services, high taxes, the fact that people are losing jobs, right? Things that might pull people into an area, you know, the fact that there's low unemployment, a variety of goods and services, numerous jobs, low taxes, right? When I usually think of economic factors, I usually think of my parents in particular. The fact that they came from Mexico, and the fact that they were living in poverty, that they couldn't find employment. They moved here to the United States. They were able to find jobs, cheap housing. They found economic opportunity, and really, that's the number one reason why people move. All right. So yeah, as people leave due to economics, the country where people originated from, right, they might suffer because of less tax revenue, which means less services, right? Other factors, we've got political here, right? What are some things that might push people out? You've got corruption, no protection, right? Discrimination, attack on your political views. Maybe there's armed conflict. Well, cut off the rest there, right? Things that might pull people in: political stability, protection of freedom, no worries about day-to-day life, right? Fair laws, cultural and social, right? Push factors, right? The cultural culture and community, maybe may not be accepting of one's race, sex, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. There may be poor access to healthcare, education, crime rate, and sometimes maybe there's just not a whole lot to do in that environment, right? So things that might pull people in culturally and socially speaking are things like high quality schools, healthcare, access to entertainment, parks, culturally accepting, right? Their gender norms, maybe people who have similar cultural backgrounds, right? Maybe why some people, if we're thinking in a smaller scale here, right, we might think of, you know, a region maybe in Oregon, maybe where people might see more of themselves in, right? Environmental factors, right? Things that push people out, areas with harsh climates, lack of arable land, lack of water. What else do we got here? Risk of natural disaster, right? Things that pull people in, nice climates. It's comfortable, safe from natural disasters. Sometimes geographic areas like lakes and rivers, because people want to live in pretty places, right? Demographic factors, all of that too, right? And maybe sometimes it's not necessarily just one of these factors. Maybe it's a combination, right? You think of an individual person, right? You may think of somebody who's might be starting off in college, the age of 18, 19, 20, right? They're looking for a social environment where there's a nightlife, they can meet people, large urban areas, right? So they're going to want to move somewhere there, right? As opposed to somebody who might be starting a family, right? Maybe you don't want to live in that that environment that's super social. Maybe you want to move somewhere more quiet where there's education, good health care, kind of that suburban life. Okay. So yeah, take a look at these factors. There's a lot to consider here. We could also look at examples, real life examples of push and pull factors. Right. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see examples of economic and push and pull factors here, right? Like factory workers in the Rust Belt states. So, where Michigan is, Chicago, Wisconsin, Ohio, right? Farmers in rural China beginning around 1950, right? So take a look at this, right? And try to pinpoint exactly, what are the specifics here, right? You've got Mormon migration, Hindu and Muslim migration during and after the partition of India, right? Things dealing socially, right? Political examples here: anti-communist Cubans fleeing after Fidel Castro's communist takeover in 1959. Okay, so again, take a look at them, read through them. Environmental here, right? It's good to know some real examples. Okay, oh, and you've got another one here too. Okay, awesome. In addition to those, reasons for migrating, right? Along the way, as people migrate, you've also got intervening obstacles and opportunities, right? So, I mean, just think back to, when you were doing that 2 billion miles video story, right? I mean, it didn't just start like we left the country and then we ended in this country, right? There's a lot of things going on in the middle, right? And actually, I'll start here with intervening obstacles. So, intervening obstacles, a force or a factor that may limit human migration, right? So maybe as you say, for example, you leave Syria and your destination is Germany, right? You might come into contact with a specific country's borders, laws, language, maybe a natural feature. In this case, maybe crossing the Mediterranean Sea. That doesn't allow the migrant to continue their migration. Sometimes, sometimes it's fatal, right? So yeah, you've also got intervening opportunity or opportunities, right? So the presence of a near opportunity that greatly diminishes the attractiveness of sites farther away, right? So I like to think of a simple example. Say you're trying to move from Oregon to New York, right? Because New York is land of opportunity. Let's just say that, right? Let's say along the way, maybe you stop, some town in Kentucky, and you find that it's pretty great there. There's a well-paying job, so maybe you don't complete the journey to New York, and you decide to stick around in Kentucky, right? Because you thought that there was an opportunity that was near, quote unquote near, but yeah, okay. So for either of these terms, the migrant has started their migration, but ultimately doesn't make it to their goal location because of one of these two. All right. So yeah, right. You can see some examples again, looking at different factors like economic, social, political, environmental. Right. So if we're thinking of economic intervening obstacles, a migrant might lack money to reach a destination. Socially, a migrant gets married to someone who lives along the migration route, settles in that person's community. Politically, maybe they can't get a visa, right? Environmental, they can't cross sea, desert, mountain range. Again, I like to think of examples of Mexico, right? Because that's my personal background, right? Maybe there's some people wanting to move from Mexico to the United States, and they may not necessarily have enough money, to complete the journey. Sometimes some of them have to cross, so plenty of rivers, the Rio Grande, for example, right, or the desert, in New Mexico and all of that. Okay. Yeah, kind of broken it down here for you again. Okay, we can kind of break it down a little bit, right? Economic again, obstacles. You might run out of money. You might face high costs. With opportunities, intervening opportunities, right? Maybe there's a job available in a closer location. Maybe the economic situation at or near your place of origin gets better, right? So, I mean, real life example, right? Syrian family, the Syrian civil war is going on. You decide to leave the country, and you get into Turkey. Your destination is Germany, but the cost is too high, so you stick around in Turkey. Right. Again, back to that example of that road trip again for intervening opportunities. Right. California to New York, right? Maybe you stop somewhere closer, Kentucky, Missouri, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, right? And you find a better opportunity elsewhere. Okay. Politically, right? You've got lost or missing paperwork. Maybe that's the obstacle. Maybe there's an inability to get a passport or visa. Intervening opportunity, right? Maybe the political situation has gotten better in the country of origin, right? So here's an example of an intervening obstacle, right? Chinese family must wait to migrate to the United States because the United States quota will only allow a certain number of people from China to enter each year, so you've got to wait a little bit. Right? Environmental, again, I kind of mentioned that, but historically, you could think of Eastern Europeans coming to the United States in the late 1800s. Right? They had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe some of them weren't willing to do that, and maybe they didn't have enough money, so they decided to stick around in Western Europe. Right? So you've got all that going on. Okay, and you could also think the migration along with the demographic transition model, right? And kind of see how things how things play out. All right, so it's good to look back at this at the end of the lecture, right? I mean, if you look at the different stages, again, information on the demographic transition model, right? You can make a correlation to how migration plays out in these countries at different stages. Okay, right. So I mean, like in stage two, you'll see a lot of people leaving the country, and moving to urban areas, right? Those in stage three, right? You might see high immigration, so taking in of migrants, right? Awesome. Cool. So we talked about causes of migration, and intervening obstacles and opportunities, that happen along the way. All right. But now we're going to look at forced and voluntary migration. So topic 2.11. Okay. So we're just going to describe the different types. All right. So forced, you got no choice. You got to move out. Voluntary, your choice to move, right? It's in the name itself. All right. But yeah, I mean, let's make the distinction very quickly of immigrants and emigrants, just so that we can start, because you'll see these two words thrown around and, it might get confusing, right? When you think of an immigrant, right, you think of, a migrant, entering a country, right? Immigrant, right? I, immigrant. So you, one person, immigrant. I like to think immigrant, right? You enter. Emigrant, right? Starts with an E. You could think of, exiting, right? So an immigrant is somebody that leaves their country, right? So, it's kind of good to see in a sentence, right? When you think of an immigrant, you think of somebody, they're an immigrant from Mexico, right? Because they left Mexico. They're an immigrant from Syria because they left Syria, right? You're an immigrant to the United States. You're an immigrant to Germany, right? So it's kind of like entering, exiting, right? Cool. So we'll begin with forced migration, you guys. Forced migrations include slavery and events that produce refugees, internally displaced persons or people, IDPs, and asylum seekers. Right. So I mean, you know, kind of, you know, obvious, but the involuntary movement of people. All right. And if you want to think of an example of forced migration, right, just think of the Atlantic slave trade, right, in the 1600s, right, as people were literally taken. Africans were literally taken from their homes and all tossed into crowded ships and made it to the Americas where they would be slaves, right? Also, think of events that produce refugees, which I'll get to in a moment, as another example of forced migrations, right? So think of the current conflict in the Middle East, specifically in Syria, right? Asylum seekers would also be, an outcome of forced migration. People who leave their home state and apply for protection in their destination state, right? Think of internally displaced persons, people who flee their home due to some event, but don't leave their home state. Okay, so yeah, when you think of forced migration, you guys think of um, think of it like like a fear going on for people, right? The fear for their safety, their family, their lives. People who know they have to leave, because for one reason or another, they can't live in peace or comfortably in their country. right? So today, people migrate due to human trafficking, forced child labor. Maybe their children are asked to become soldiers. There's war, persecution regarding religion, politics, the way of life, right? Like gender, sexual orientation, that kind of stuff, right? So when you have a founded fear, we can say, right, and you leave, you're technically they're being forced, right? Cool. So here we are, refugees. A person who is outside of their country and unable or unwilling to return. All right. So refugees, they leave their country based on a founded fear, and they typically have a couple of characteristics. One, they move without, um, you know, tangible property. They only carry what they're able to, right? So it's not like they're gonna have a backpack, right, with television or anything, right? They're gonna have the essentials, right? Passport, some food, a couple of dollars, maybe some memorables from their home to have, right? Because of importance. Right? And usually, first move is by foot, boat, bike, or a wagon. Some of them don't carry official papers, that come with normal migration. So, it's possible, that when they reach their destination country, they won't be let in. Okay. But yeah, refugees seeking protection from another country ultimately they flee due to war, political persecution, religious persecution, natural disasters as well, right? And that's when they become asylum seekers, right? That's why I put that under here, right? Because refugees end up becoming asylum seekers, um, where again they're seeking protection from another country. Okay. Now, internally displaced persons, right? They're not exactly refugees. So if somebody was to flee Syria, right, out of the country, right, then they're a refugee slash asylum seeker. But if they were to move to a different part of Syria, but they can't go back home either because they're unable to or unwilling to, right? That's when they're an internally displaced person, right? They're still in their country, right? But they they can't go back home. Okay. So some examples, to think about and consider, and thinking about different factors like political and environmental, right? Think of refugees, Jews that fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, finding safety in other countries like the United States, for example. All right, environmental. Think of Haitians, the earthquake in 2010, right? Internally displaced people, right? The Louisianans, right? Did I say it right? Fleeing to neighboring states after Hurricane Katrina. So they're within the country. So therefore, they're internally displaced people, right? Cool. So yeah, you've got forced migration there. I'll come back to these in a minute. But we could look at history and you know the last 60, 70 years and really pinpoint some examples of large scale forced migration, right? World War II, you've got 40 million Europeans were displaced because of the war, right? The partition of India and Pakistan, right? 14 million displaced, right? The establishment of Israel, right? 1 million Palestinians displaced. And it's not here on the map, but large scale there, right? We could think of the end of the colonial era and the post Cold War era, right? There are 32 separate incidents, where 46.5 million are displaced, right? And, all of this is caused because of, decolonization movements, proxy wars, decline of the Soviet Union, right? It's just some small examples here, right? Africa, got the Algerian War, the Rwandan genocide, where 3.2 million are displaced, the Bangladesh War of Independence, 10 million, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 6.3 million, Vietnam War, 3 million, right? So couple of examples, right? And of course, today, instability in the Middle East, right? Specifically in Syria since 2011. You've got a civil war where there are over 12 million people. Okay. So, yeah. Overall, the United Nations, they've estimated that there are about 71 million people who have been forcibly displaced or, forced to migrate. 41 million of those are internally displaced people. 26 million are refugees. 3.5 are asylum seekers. Okay, and you can see here the top refugee hosting countries, right? Like Turkey is the top one, no doubt about it. Germany is up there, 1.1 million. Pakistan, right? And really, it's Turkey, because that's kind of the gateway. It's in the middle of mainland Europe, and most of what we would think of Europe and the Middle East. All right. So yeah, top 10 destination countries for refugees and asylum seekers. Again, you can kind of see what this is, and by and large, Turkey. When we think of the United States hosting refugees and asylum seekers, right, we can see where the top countries of origin for refugees and asylum seekers are, right? China, El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela, Honduras. Right? So a lot of it is, local, right? Local, right? Central America, South America, right? So yeah, right. And this goes back, we can see that in comparison, with historical trends of, migration in the United States, right? Today, it's Latin America and Asia, right? Before it was, Northern, Western Europe, right? Maybe hence why a lot of people are say they're Irish in the United States, right? Okay, for Europe, it's kind of changed. Flows have changed, so people are now coming to Europe. They're not leaving anymore, and mainly that's from the Middle East, South Asia, and West Africa. All right. So yeah, forced migration. Okay. Okay. Up next, we've got voluntary migration. So when somebody makes the choice to leave, right? It's not like they're one day all of a sudden due to circumstances, because of a fear, they have to leave. This is, due to choice, whether, and again, it has to do with economic reasons, some of it, political reasons. Right? I mean, they could stay if they want to, but this is voluntary, right? So there are a couple, all right. First is transnational migration, and this is, essentially migration between two different states, right, or two different countries, right? The migrant moves across an international border, right? Don't let states trick you. I meant countries there, right? But yeah, movement and settlement across international bodies. People move between two countries, and usually with transnational migration, people keep ties between their home country and the country they move to. All right. So I like to think of, again, my parents coming from Mexico. They willingly moved to the United States, crossed international boundaries, and we still keep ties, with family over there, right? Phone calls, maybe we might help them out economically, right? And people that transnational migration. When this happens, people when they move, to a different country, they wanna move somewhere where it feels familiar, right? So maybe you might want to move to an area, and if somebody from Mexico wanted to move here in this area, and the East Co area, East Moltco area, right? They might want to move somewhere in Gresham, maybe that has a pretty large, Hispanic population, right? Next, we've got transhumance migration, a type of seasonal migration done by livestock herders. So it's basically seasonal movement of livestock, right? And with this, farmers, ranchers, they migrate to the highlands, upper elevations during hot summer, and then come to the lowland, lower elevation pastures during winter, right, to avoid freezing snow. All right, so movement of livestock and animals, it's temporary, cyclical. Next, we've got internal migration, so permanent move within a country, right? So you've got interregional and intra-regional, right? So I mean, when you think of an intra-regional, um, intra-regional migration, right? You think of people that want to emigrate from um, you know, locally, right? Maybe they want to move from the rural area to the urban. So like Sandy, Oregon, maybe to Portland, right? For one reason or another, right? Interregional, right? We could think of that as staying within the country, obviously, but moving in a different region, right? So maybe somebody in the South, maybe they got tired of the South and decided to move to the Pacific Northwest, right? Because of economic opportunities, maybe not the climate, right? But maybe the view, right? That kind of stuff. Okay. So interregional there, right? Movement of one region to another region in the country, right? And while interregional, you kind of, stay local, you could say. Okay. Next, chain migration. This type of migration follows the path of a previous migrant. So, let's think of an example here, right? You've got a daughter who gained citizenship in the United States from a different country, right? They came from a different country, they gained citizenship in the United States, and now they're petitioning for their parents or spouse to gain citizenship, right? So again, follows the path of a previous migrant, right? And typically, this person might sponsor a friend or a family member, then they move to a location and they communicate back to where they came from, how many opportunities there are, right? Again, I like to think of my family, right? The reason they kind of moved over to the United States is because they had friends and family who were already here, told them about how it was, and now they're here. Okay. Next, you've got step migration, right? In step migration, the migrants move in small steps to an ultimate large city destination. So it's in the name, step migration. You go step by step. It's not like it's one whole movement, from point A to point B. You've got point A1 and A2 and all that, right? So the move to a close location where they can rebuild some resources or get resources, and then moving into the next step. All right. So really, this kind of highlights, the fact that migration occurs in stages, all right, and that most migrants have an end goal in mind. They have to cross many areas. Okay. So don't forget intervening opportunities and obstacles within STEM migration. Right. We've got guest worker migrants. So a migrant given temporary legal status to work, or maybe they're given temporary legal status for education related reasons. All right, and usually this happens, when some countries are in need of new ideas and talents, or maybe they just need to work in certain areas, right? So usually guest workers, might do seasonal work like picking fruit and veggies on a farm, working in hotels during busy seasons. All right, I got a couple examples here, right? So think of a nurse from the Philippines, comes over to the United States. Maybe the hospital might need nurses, is in dire need. So, obviously they get some from abroad, and when the nurse gets her paycheck, right, a portion of the salary goes back to her family, right, and that's one of the key characteristics of guest worker migrants. So they get something called remittances, right? So where they're able to send money back home, right? Part of their paycheck goes home or goes back to their country of origin, right? Where they can support their families. All right, guest worker. Historically, we could think of guest worker migrants, right? We could think of after World War II, West Germany, right? Many of the men who served in the war died, right? So the young population of men, was pretty low. So they need workers to work in the factories and mines. So they bring in Turkish workers and to help rebuild the country's infrastructure, right? So that's one historical example, right? Last here, rural to urban migration. Most migration is rural to urban usually. People moving from small villages and farming communities to large urban areas, right? And really, this happens because they're seeking opportunities that don't exist in the rural areas, whether it's high tech jobs, education, maybe the lack of resources and services and goods and all of that. So again, think back to push and pull factors, right? Yeah. So again, usually it's because of economic factors, that people move. So yeah, if we're thinking globally, rural to urban migration, or people moving to urban areas, has increased since 1950. Today, about 55% of the world's population live in urban areas, as opposed to 30% in 1950. So you can see just how much through that statistic alone, people are moving to the urban areas. Okay, awesome. So yeah, that's 2.11 there, right? Forced and voluntary. Okay, so now last topic here, we've got the effects of migration. Okay, a little bit different here, all right? Learning objective. Explain historical, contemporary geographic effects of migration. Okay, so let's just look at political and social to begin, right? If we're thinking today, right? So political effects of migration. Obviously, you know, you've got debates about migration, right? One of the hot topic things in the United States, actually, the last couple of years, right? Or maybe since always, right? The debate of whether should I'm going to use the United States as an example, right? Should the United States let people in? Is it good or bad to let people in? You know, and when debates happen on migration, you've got stereotypes developing, maybe on both sides, right? Or maybe on one side, right? If you've got a debate going on, then you've got you might get some policies about cracking down on immigrants, right? And if you have a crackdown on immigrants, that could lead to illegal immigration, and when that happens, you could get bad results in the end, fatalities, or people just trying to flee the for their own safety. Maybe they're not let in because of policies in the country, specifically the United States, right? So I mean, I like to think of that the example of Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and all of that, right? Because when you think of refugees, when you think of asylum seekers, right? The UN has kind of labeled, what not labeled, but what falls under the category of how they can be let in, right? Usually it's because of war, it's because of religious persecution, right? But some of the language that's written in there, doesn't account for some things. Like maybe they're being forced to marry someone. Maybe like young girls are forced to marry older men in in different countries, or maybe they're being targeted by gangs, right? Gang warfare in Nicaragua and El Salvador, right? And you've got people trying to come in to the United States, and that they can't, right? Because it doesn't fall in line with what the UN is saying, okay, or what their language is, what their policy is. So again, you know, this whole debate about migration, could lead to things like that, right? Where you've got crackdown on immigrants, right? It leads to legal immigration, and that leads to complexities with people who are trying to flee their own country and they're not let in. So where do they go? All right. So hopefully that makes sense there, right? If we're thinking politically as well, immigration can cause a strain on the resources of an area. That could have a huge impact on healthcare and education, right? Maybe there's a change in political beliefs and makeups of an area, right? Which sometimes maybe isn't all that bad, right? Because new migrants come in with different views of the world, right? But new migrants usually have different political beliefs from the native population. Okay. Socially, we could think of citizens getting involved, debates about migration and quota policies and refugees, right? Social breakdown too. If we're thinking about governments from the top, right? Governments can influence the social breakdown of a country, whether that's through like quotas or limitations, right? And again, that can have positive and negative effects. It hinders some areas from being able to migrate in. Some countries are trying to attract certain people and talents and those who assimilate well. So maybe the government, is placing a harsh limitations on different countries. Okay, this looks kind of blurry here, but yeah, we can think of historical examples again of migration and the kind of effects, political effects that this causes, right? So, I mean, we could look at Jewish immigration from Germany. So, immigration again, they're leaving Germany, right? You could see that they travel all over Europe. A lot of them go to the United States, right? But we can see, just we can still see the impacts, right, of on what this had on Germany, right, economically and socially, right, and how this leads to the creation of the country of Israel, the state of Israel, right? We could also look at the Trail of Tears as an example, under President Andrew Jackson, and I think it was the 1820s or maybe it was the 1830s, right? And again, 200 years later, we could see the impacts of the Trail of Tears, right? Still remembered, and leading to different um, reservations across the United States, native reservations. Yep. And we could also look at more recent migration patterns, in the United States, right? If we're thinking of the Sun Belt region, right? So in the 1970s, you know, and actually after World War II, I should say, right, you've got people in the north here leaving the area and kind of moving to more south, right, for one reason or another, right? Better climate, you mainly to Florida, Texas, California, right? And you know, political effects today, we see that California, Texas, and Florida, you know, all we have to do is look at the electoral votes for these countries, and you know, see the impact that they play. Right, the population is large, right? A lot of famous companies in these areas. Okay, again, Sunbelt region, so you know, because a lot of people had automobile access and you know, air conditioning, made those places more attractive, and you know, now the countries that I just mentioned, you know, they've got a lot of political power. Cool. Economic effects, you know, population growth and workers, right? So, you know, a country gets more people in, you know, bigger population, tax revenues increases, right? More workers, right? Unemployment might be low, right? So yeah, loss of income or gain of income to an area, dependent on migration flow, right? Something I'll talk about here in a minute, right? The brain drain. Um, so you know, can have a negative impact on a region. But the region receiving the migrants has a positive chance at innovation, you know, with the brain drain. All right. So yeah, you know, so societies, you know, reject immigrants, resist immigrants, a lot of times, and you know, there are a lot of disadvantages to that. You know, it's the loss of talent, diversity. So I mean, if we look back at the demographic transition model, right, a lot of countries in stage 4 and stage 5 kind of have their doubts about immigrants entering, right? But I mean, we know, right, as geographers, that those countries in stage 5, some in stage 4, right, you know, the birth rate is low. You know, a lot of people are not having kids, right? So in the future, you know, that decreases the workforce, right? And something about immigrants is that, you know, it helps counter that. So, you know, countries, societies that resist immigrants or reject, you know, might face consequences of that later. All right. You know, but also negative impacts, negative economic impacts as well, right? If we're looking at Sweden, for example, right? You know, when the whole refugee crisis in the early 2010s started, right? A lot of people in Sweden, you know, were saying, you know, based on surveys, of course, right? You know, that they would happily take in immigrants. But you know, now that a lot of the jobs are being reduced for native-born citizens, so native Swedish people, right? The number of people who have supported immigration in Sweden has kind of decreased by like 30%, right? I think it was at 60% once, and now it's at 30%. Okay, but yeah, but again, economic reasons, right? If you've got people leaving a country, right, you've got less workers, right, could lead to an economic collapse and the loss of a valuable workforce, right? So, in addition to that, again, brain drain, right, the loss of the best and brightest labor from an area because of a lack of opportunity. So, if there are opportunities or reason for people to live in an area, you know, that's what they'll experience, a brain drain, right? Less people to work, less tax revenue, right? And lastly, cultural effects of migration here. So loss of culture in some regions due to new migrants coming in, right, can be seen as threatening. Could lead to you know, instances of racism and conflict, right? But at the same time, you know, they're bringing in a new language, culture, right? And that could also have a huge impact, right? Introducing new stuff too, right? Demographic shifts can happen since migrants tend to be young, right? U.S. still growing due to migration, right? And if not for migration, right, the U.S. population would be declining, right? So yeah, quotas, limits, you know, those have, you know, those limit the number of immigrants admitted. Um, but yeah, I mean, as has been well shown in the last few years, immigrants can be claimed for social ills and can face persecution. Okay, but yeah, you've got cultural factors, economic factors, and political factors. Okay, so yeah, there you go, you guys. Topics 2.10, 2.11, and 2.12. All right, a lot of stuff to cover. So you know, take a look back and kind of take a glance at some of the examples. All right. So yeah, let me know if you have questions, and I will answer them.